Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University here on Medscape Cardiology and theheart.org. Over the course of the last several months, I've had the opportunity and really the privilege to interview several colleagues in medicine who have written books not intended necessarily for the medical audience, but for a broader audience where they have had the opportunity to comment on some of the issues that they see as important in not just the practice of medicine, but how all of us interact with healthcare across the country. One of the things that's certainly gotten a lot of attention on Medscape is how physicians are feeling under siege from things like the overflow of information through the electronic health records. And you sense in reading the forums and reading articles written online and some of the blogs that electronic health records, while they have promised efficiency in people's practices, have frustrated clinicians to no small degree. I had the recent opportunity to interview Eric Topol in a podcast that's published online now with Medscape. And it's clear that the amount of information that will be available to practitioners in the coming years is going to be enormous. And how we as a community deal with that information in a way that helps our patients and helps us as providers take better care of our patients in a partnership sort of way is no small task. In fact, one might call it daunting. Well, today I'm really privileged to talk to a colleague who is nearby at the University of California, San Francisco, about his latest book, The Digital Doctor. So I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. Bob Wachter from University of California, San Francisco, who is a professor of medicine and the interim chair of the Department of Medicine at UCSF. Bob is also the longstanding director of the Division of Hospital Medicine at UCSF. Most recently, and for the purposes of this discussion, he's the author of the New York Times science bestseller, The Digital Doctor. So, Bob, thanks for joining us here on Medscape Cardiology.
Thank you for having me, Bob. It's a great pleasure.
Bob, I have a whole series of questions that I'm going to try to break into the categories of how this relates clinically and what are some of the educational opportunities that might emerge as we think about the information age in medical practice. Let me start with the relatively straightforward question. Why did you decide to write the book, and what were you hoping to accomplish?
I'll start with the second part first. I wanted to generate a national conversation about our computers and where we were and why we weren't quite getting it right. The reason I decided to write it was that I have been anticipating the computerization of medicine for a decade or more. We're way behind the curve. Most other industries have gone digital a long time ago. And I think, any of us that takes out our iPhone and just looks at the magic that computers have brought to us at so many walks of life, couldn't help but say, wow, once we get computerized, things will get better. And I think for me in particular, as the student of patient safety, I can't tell you the number of root cause analyses I've been at in the last 15 years where we all said to ourselves, if we just had computers, this would be great. But they finally entered our world in the last several years, and I found myself scratching my head more often than not. Why were doctors and patients not making eye contact anymore? Why were we seeing decreases in efficiency rather than increases? Why were we preventing certain kinds of errors but causing new ones? And the main event that led to my decision to write the book was at UCSF a few years ago. We gave a kid a 39-fold overdose of a common antibiotic. The correct dose was 1 pill. We gave 39 pills. And as we were dissecting how it happened, it was a completely digital environment. As we were dissecting how it happened, I just said, oh, my God, these computers are capable of causing breathtaking errors, and we haven't really thought deeply about how that could happen and what we need to do to make things better. And so that led me to come home and said, I need to write a book. My wife is a journalist, and she said, the only way you're going to get this right is to do it journalistically. And we talked about that. She said, that means going out and talking to a whole lot of people. And so I interviewed about 100 different people from all walks of life to try to really understand where we are and how we get to that better place.
Kudos to your UCSF colleagues, and maybe kudos most of all to the patient and his mother who allowed you to tell the story, because that anecdote, I think, captures people's attention.
I'm very proud of the organization. I think, you can imagine, Bob, at the end of hearing that case, I went up to the risk manager at UCSF, who, whose job in part is to protect us. And I said, I think we really need to talk about this case. And she said, yeah, that's right. We should have some grand rounds. And I said, not exactly what I mean by that. I'm not saying, within the walls. I'm talking about broadly. And I almost had to put out her hair, which was on fire, but ultimately got the permission not only of the CEO and chief medical officer, but of the patient and his mother and the participating doctor, nurse, and pharmacist. And I think it's an act of both individual and organizational bravery. And my feeling is if we don't talk about this stuff, we're never going to get it right.
Well, it harkens back to the original days of autopsy and then the days of the CPC, of really trying to dissect cases to get at what the underlying answer is. And in many ways, this was a digital postmortem. And
Yeah.
I give you guys a lot of credit for doing it, because these are not easy things to do. And certainly the self-reflection involved from all parties, the pharmacist and the nurse in particular, was quite moving, actually, to read those passages. Did they have that kind of emotion as you spoke with them?
Oh, my goodness. First of all, I like your analogy, because I think in the old days we were very comfortable with the idea of a postmortem on a patient to find out what was wrong with them physiologically. The idea of doing a system postmortem is a relatively new concept in medicine, but I think it's extraordinarily powerful. We have to say to ourselves, when something went wrong, how do we understand the system in order to fix its disease? And I think that was my feeling here. We had to do this. I'll tell you, when I interviewed the nurse, and for folks who don't know the case, the nurse sort of at the end of a fairly long train of errors that involved the technology and the interaction of the people with the technology, the nurse sees an order in her electronic queue that says this kid is supposed to get 39 pills. And she looks at it and she says, that seems kind of crazy. But she was floating on an unfamiliar floor. She's a relatively new nurse at UCSF. And she said, to get to me, it must have gone through a doctor and a pharmacist and the pharmacy robot. And she said, I'm going to check it against my technology. And so she barcodes it. And of course, she has great trust in the barcode. It saved her many times. And the barcode says the correct dose is 39 pills, because the job of the barcode at that point in the medication process is to defend the order. Once the doc and the pharmacist says this is correct, the barcode is designed to tell the nurse, make sure you give what the order is. And if the order is crazy, the barcode tells you that, yes, you should do that. So she ended up giving this kid 39 pills. When I interviewed this nurse, a delightful young woman, had a perfect record, well-trained, and I said, what were you thinking? And of course, in retrospect, she knows it's a ludicrous order, but at the time, in the moment, with so many signals, including electronic signals, that it was correct, she did what humans do, which is sort of convince themselves it seems weird, but it's probably right. I said, what were you thinking? She said, I was thinking, to tell you the truth, I was thinking what a trooper this 16-year-old is to take all these pills. What a good kid. And then she stopped and she broke down and started crying. Deeply, deeply affected, obviously feels terrible about this. One of the things I liked about doing this kind of thing is I think that she felt she was doing some good in talking about the case. And clearly, not only was it published in the book, but it was published on a website called Medium and went fairly viral. I've heard from a lot of people who said, I haven't done exactly this, but I've done something like this, and I never had an opportunity to talk about it. So I think there is something cathartic about feeling like you're making the system better.
Yeah, no, and it comes across. So again, kudos to the nurse and to you for drawing out that story. One of the issues that you bring out, Bob, throughout the book, and that certainly resonated with me, and maybe is implied in that anecdote of everyone relying upon digital connections and digital communication. You talk a lot about the culture of medicine and how you worry that we're losing some of that connectivity on a personal level. You reference our mutual friend, Abraham Verghese, who talks a lot about connectiveness and the rituals of medicine. Well, one of the rituals that I loved in your book was the concept of radiology rounds. You want to talk a little bit about how the radiology rounds, almost as a metaphor, speaks to the changing culture of medicine and one of the things you were trying to get at?
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed writing that chapter, and it was one of those epiphanies where I said, I hadn't even thought about it, but then I thought about the world of my training days and probably yours, where there was no question the central hub of the hospital where I went to med school in Philadelphia at Penn. The central hub was the chest reading room, because every day, every team, medical and surgical, came through the chest reading room like cars coming through a car wash, stopped. The radiologist was seated in front of the alternator, put his foot on the pedal, it found your films, He'd say to the team, me as the med student, he'd say, "What's going on?" You'd say, "This is a 42-year-old woman with lupus and shortness of breath." And he says, "What do you think this is?" And I'd say, "Pneumonia." And he'd say, "Nah." He'd say, "Look at this. That's not pneumonia. That's TB. That's fungus. That's cancer." That give and take, that exchange was incredibly rich. It was fun. It was stressful. It was our way of sense-making, not only for the primary team taking care of the patient, but for the radiologist. It was their connection to the world of direct patient care. Well, radiology went digital about 15 years ago, well before the rest of medicine, in part because now we were doing CAT scans and MRIs that were throwing off 100 films, and the cost of printing them became impossible, and the cost of digital storage fell. So radiology went digital almost overnight around the year 2000. Nobody anticipated that would do anything to radiology rounds. How could they? I went back and read the literature and interviewed some old-time radiologists and said, "Did you even sort of muse about the possibility it's going to change the nature of your relationship with the frontline clinicians?" And they all said, "No, not at all." But the minute that radiology went digital, those rounds stopped. And nobody wanted them to stop, but we realized in retrospect that the reason we went down for those rounds was because that was the only incarnation of the film. It lived in only one place, and the radiologist controlled it. And it was what created and facilitated the geography and the communication patterns. The minute it ended, radiology rounds ended. And so now we're reading reports, and now we're looking at our films at home and looking at them on the floor, on the computer. And that's all terrific. I mean, none of us would really want to go back to the day where there's only one copy of the film and we could only see it in the radiology department. But we've given absolutely no thought to the notion that because the film is now digital, we have completely thrown a hand grenade in the middle of this vital communication for both clinical care and for mutual education. And that became part of you're right, I think, a metaphor for the larger story, which is that digitization of the thing, whether it's the film in this case or the electronic medical record, changes everything. It changes everything about the geography, the communication patterns, how people think. And what most industries do is what we did, which is to not be very thoughtful or very deep about the implications of that. You digitize the thing and you continue to have all of your old processes. And then lo and behold, a few years later, everybody kind of wakes up and says, that's not what I expected would happen. We're not talking to each other, or it's changed the nature of education, or whatever it is. And we're not seeing the promised benefits. And there's this concept that I came upon called the productivity paradox, which is that in every industry that goes digital, it takes often 10, 15 years before you really see the massive benefits. And it's partly because the technology gets better, but it's actually much more importantly that people begin reimagining the work. And so they begin to say, all right, we now have this digital tool. Of course we want digital x-rays. It's better. But now how do we think about the ways frontline clinicians and radiologists communicate, the way doctors and patients communicate in a digital era? I think that was probably the main point I wanted to get across, that we have to think about our work in a brand new way. Digitizing medicine is not just taking your analog world and making it digital. It's an entirely new business, and I don't think we've given it sufficient thought in order to get it right.
Yeah, I could not agree more. For me, the joy of making rounds in the hospital, in part, is the physical act of walking around and meeting with colleagues, be they consultants who are seeing your patients, other services that want your input, the radiologist, the cath lab, all of the things that you go to look at. And as you go to look at it, yes, it's acquiring the information, but more importantly, I think it's bringing to bear the expertise in that social environment that is medicine. And I love how you said it, because I think you say it in your book, and I will certainly say it from my own perspective, both you and I like technology a lot.
Yep.
And yet somehow we've got to figure out, with whatever our socialization of medicine requires, that we figure out a way to take advantage of the great technologies, but don't leave absent the social aspect of what we do.
And it's very important, I think, Bob, to not get too nostalgic. And I think there's a tendency to do that for geezers like us, to say, let's just recreate radiology rounds the way it used to be. And young folks will say, why? That's crazy. Why should we schlep down 10 floors to go look at the film if the film is anywhere? So you have to say, what are we trying to do? There is something fundamentally important about an exchange between two human beings about a complex case, if it's a consultant, or about a film, if it's radiology. How do we build that back in a way that probably doesn't just echo what we used to do 30 years ago. It may look very different. It may be a digital conversation. Who knows? It may be through Skype. It's an open playing field now, and I think the technology will be part of the solution. But the core thing is to say what is lost and what's fundamentally important about what's lost, and how do we re-envision it in our new era, given all the new pressures and the new opportunities that the digital tools bring to us. We barely scratched the surface of that conversation.
Yeah, I could not agree more that it's not just replacing what we had, but it's really improving on it. I think about work that our Vice Dean for Education is doing here with the flipped classroom. And, you and I probably both have memories of half the class sleeping through med school lectures. And now what they've said is, okay, we all learn at different paces. Watch those lectures at home in 5-10 minute snippets, and then come to class prepared to engage in problem solving, at case dissection. And you watch one of these flipped classrooms where the medical students are coming to really do problem solving. Wow, what an improvement on how you and I went to medical school.
Yeah, it's so interesting in so many ways because, this younger generation comes in, and I think the key thing is to convince them, if you need to, of kind of the core values, that communication is important, that engagement is important of all the parties. And then they will teach us, and they'll say, yes, it would be great if we could have a discussion with the radiologist or with the cardiology consultants about this case, but why not do it this new way? And I don't think you and I would ever figure that out. It's very, very important to sort of make clear that it sounds like neither you nor I or Luddites, and I hear this periodically from people, I wrote a book critical of where we are in our technological evolution. And people will come up to me and say, don't you think we should just pull out the wires and bring back the 3-ring binders? I think they're crazy.
No.
No, we can't do that. People sometimes say, well, couldn't we have bypassed this incredibly clunky stage we find ourselves at now if we'd been more clever and gone right to this better place? And I'm not sure that was possible either. I think until you implement the technology and say, that's surprising, I'm not sure any of us are smart enough to really kind of anticipate the issues and prophylax against them. One of my favorite quotes was, I have this in the book, Henry Ford was reputed to have said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have told me faster horses.
Yeah,
and that's
I like
the
that.
idea that none of us are smart enough to really, we don't have enough imagination to envision what our life will be like in this new technological environment. But once you're in it, then you have to say, wow, that's not what I expected, or we've had some major gains, but we've had some really profound losses. How do we deal with that in this new environment? That's really what I try to generate here.
No, it comes across. Now, one of the analogies that you make throughout the book, and certainly others have done this as well, is the comparison between healthcare delivery and flying a plane, aviation. And there was a comment or a series of comments that really struck me, Bob, and I'm wondering if you can reflect upon, whereby the engineers who make planes for pilots to fly are very cognizant of the, I think you call it the pilot experience. And they don't want to eliminate that pilot experience. And yet in medicine, you've commented in the book that there doesn't seem to be that same attention paid to the doc, to the nurse, to the advanced practice provider at the front line. It's really about just the machinery. And do you want to reflect on that? What's different between engineers and hospital administrators?
Well, I'm not sure it's engineers versus hospital administrators, because I think in some ways the more relevant comparison is the engineers at Boeing and the engineers at Epic or at Cerner.
Okay.
Because both of them are developing IT tools and systems designed to make the work better and safer. They have the same job in many ways. But I think you're right. I had a chance to interview Captain Sullenberger, who landed on the Hudson, and he's a remarkable guy. And we were talking about the Air France flight that crashed off the coast of Brazil several years ago. And he said, if you're really going to research how this all works, don't take it from me. Go up to Boeing and spend a day with the engineers there. So a few calls from Sully, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting in a 777 simulator, which was just a remarkable experience, and talking to the chief engineers of Boeing's cockpits. And what was so extraordinarily impressive to me was a major cultural difference between what I heard from them and what I heard from technology engineers and vendors in the healthcare space. When I talk to the ones in healthcare, these are really smart people trying to do the right thing, but they are very, very distant from the delivery of care. And I think in their heart of hearts, they think they're doing the right thing. They think that doctors and nurses are, important cogs in the system, but mainly are kind of technophobic obstacles. And they also, if you think about it, they're designing their systems not only for us, but also for the people doing the billing and the people doing the malpractice prevention, and the people doing quality measurement. And so they have a really hard job. And I'd say it's on two levels. One is the multiplicity of audience and stakeholders they're trying to satisfy. And of course, by doing that, they satisfy none of them. And the second is, Epic does not run a hospital. Cerner does not run a hospital. So for them to actually understand what their tools do in the real life practice of medicine for a primary care doc in the office or one of us running around the hospital is very hard for them to do. They have to get out of the office and really see it in a very different way. Boeing engineers, on the other hand, first of all they are trying to do is build a system that safely gets your plane from San Francisco to JFK. And that's it. They're not thinking about billing. They're not thinking about malpractice. They're thinking about doing this thing safely. That makes their job much more straightforward. But I think much more importantly was a cultural issue, which is when I asked them about how they think about user testing and watching the pilots using their machines before they set them out into nature. They said, of course we do that. We wouldn't dream of developing a cockpit computer and then not watch the pilots use it for thousands of hours. And they said, because A, we're not smart enough to get it right all the time. We're going to think that this will work a certain way, and we watch the pilots, and it's like, wow, I didn't guess that they'd do that. So that's just part of their philosophy. But what was even richer was they said things like, we have a deep, deep reverence for the pilots and their tradition and their history, and we know people have died to give us these lessons. And there was a part of it that almost sounded Hallmark cardy, like this is sort of hokey, but it was very, very real. And I think it leads them to a way of approaching their work that builds in this kind of user-centered design, not as a checklist. Yes, we need to watch what happens when the doctors use the system, but as a core philosophy of what they're trying to do. And I don't think that has happened in healthcare. And as I say, I think it's harder to do in healthcare because of the multiplicity of interests and because of the complexity and because Epic does not run a hospital.
Well said. Let me focus on the education issue. And I'd like you first, maybe, Bob, to comment on what do we do about our current crop of doctors, people like you and me who grew up in a different age, and yes, some of us wax nostalgic, but some of us just want to get through the day and get our job done. What kind of education or tools can we give the current doc? And then we'll turn our attention in closing to the next generation.
For many current docs, they're going through a huge amount of disruption, and electronic health records and the digitization of their profession is only a small part of it. As I think about the world, I think of really twin pillars of the digitization of healthcare and the value pressure, neither of which existed, all of which really changed the ballgame for people that have been practicing for many years. And for folks that had it good in the old days and liked their profession and liked their autonomy, it's hard. And we have to be sympathetic to the plight of the modern physician, but not too sympathetic, because I think that we also have to recognize that as wonderful as it might have been to have been Marcus Welby, there's good evidence that the quality of the care we delivered wasn't all that good, and the costs are bankrupting the country, and patients were often not satisfied, and we have to do better. And so we can't just sit down and say, let's turn the clock back 30 years. We have to improve, and doctors have to learn how to use the technology. Now, I think part of the fault here is in the technology. It's sort of saying, can a 60-year-old doctor learn to use OpenTable or Uber is a laughable question. The answer is, of course, they use it all the time because the technology is so good, it's just natural. And I think that the fact that some older doctors are struggling with technology is not a design flaw in the people, it's a design flaw in the technology. It's just got to get better, and I think it will.
That's well said. I think about this every day when I see my 80-year-old mother-in-law online on Facebook talking with her grandchildren and looking at pictures, contributing to the conversation. You're absolutely right.
If we get the technology right, I think anybody can use it. I think we will, but we haven't yet, and that's a flaw not in the doctors, but in the technology vendors.
Bob, let's talk about the next generation, and are we doing the right things, so to speak, in both medical school and during medical training? And maybe I'll put it into two issues. Number one, are we teaching them enough about the quantitative sciences? Are we teaching them enough about technology and its interfaces? Are we teaching them enough about how to communicate appropriately during medical school? And then, is our apprenticeship model still the best for medical training, or should we be rethinking that paradigm as well? I mean, medical internship in some ways looks different than yours and mine, but in many ways, if you just looked at their schedule, it looks very similar to yours and mine.
Yeah. Well, these are huge questions. I was just at an AMA-sponsored conference here a few weeks ago where they were talking about the future of medical education, and they asked me, what should they learn about technology? And I said, it's not EPIC 101. It's not sort of how to use the computer, because A, they'll figure that out on their own, and B, it's going to be so core a part of their orientation to their clinical rotations. I think it really is sort of using data in new ways, communicating in new ways, learning about innovation in new ways, because I think what the young people can do where they're uniquely situated to do is they don't have a pre-existing view of what medicine needs to look like. And so they will come in and they will say, here's the values that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to, let's say, produce a good note, because that's the vehicle that we use to communicate with each other and increasingly communicate with patients as more and more patients can read their notes. I think it's going to be the young people who teach us what does a good note look like in the digital era. And, people sort of talk about the vendors have created these templates that are clunky and check boxes and all that. Well, that's part of it. But I think we need to educate each other about, what does communication look like in the digital era? How do we communicate with radiologists? How do we communicate with patients in the digital era? I think what we want to give our students is a core set of values, obviously some underlying education and foundational education about how the technology works. And certainly the rest of medicine has not gone away. They have to learn the core medicine that we had to learn as well. But I think once armed with those core values and what we're trying to achieve, I think in some ways the skill set will be leadership and change management and kind of re-envisioning their work in their workplace to make it better. And I have great confidence that they will do that. I tell the story in the book of talking to the medical students at UCSF a year or two ago, and I said, I was trying to shake them up, and I said, you people are going to be under unrelenting pressure to figure out how to deliver high-quality, safe, satisfying care at the lowest possible cost. Very different than the world I entered 30 years ago. And one of them raised his hand, and he said, what exactly were you people trying to do?
I read that in the book.
For them, it's what we're asking of them and of all of us is completely natural. And the fact that we're saying, and you have to do it in a digital environment, if we said you don't have to do it in a digital environment, they say, are you crazy? Of course we need digital tools. That's how we live our lives. So I think they're going to give us more answers than questions. And I wouldn't focus too much on the nuances of this piece of technology or the other. I think it's the bigger picture issues of how do you use these tools to the betterment of your patients and to the core values, and then how do you innovate and how do you make systems work better? I think that's the core of the education.
Yeah, I wrote in our department newsletter not that long ago that if you've ever worried about the future of American medicine, meet today's medical students and you won't. Because they're going to get us there, because they're bright, they're talented, they're in many ways inspirational, and they do think differently than you or I, and that's a good thing. Well, Bob, I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank the Medscape listeners for listening in. I've been privileged to have a conversation with Bob Wachter, who's a professor of medicine at UCSF and the author of the New York Times Science best-selling book, The Digital Doctor. Bob, thanks for joining us here on the Heart.org and Medscape Cardiology.
It was really a great pleasure, Bob. Thanks so much.